Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin. Story 1. The long, uneventful reign of King Ethelred the Unready. It was a damp morning in the year 978 AD when a 10-year-old child ascended the throne of England. His name was Ethelred, and he would come to be known by a title that history has remembered with a smirk, the Unready. But in truth, that moniker derived from the Old English word unread, meaning bad counsel, tells us far more about the machinery of medieval governance than about Ethelred himself. You might imagine the rise of a monarch in such times to be accompanied by fanfare or heroism, but Ethelred's accession was marred by quiet whispers and deep mistrust. His half-brother, King Edward the Martyr, had been stabbed in the gut while dismounting his horse at Corfe Castle. The boy King Ethelred ascended to power not with cheers, but with a pall of suspicion and political fog. What followed was not so much a reign as a slow, grinding march through indecision, poor counsel, and missed opportunities. Not grand wars, not dramatic reforms, just a series of wearying, slow-building crises that never seemed to reach resolution. It's a story not of glorious battles or epic romance, but of poor planning, creeping dread, and administrative fatigue. Let's begin with the setting. A kingdom in fragile balance. At the time of Ethelred's coronation, England was still a newly unified realm. The kingdoms of Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Wessex had only recently begun operating as one, thanks to the efforts of Alfred the Great and his successors. But unification had not bred stability. The local ealdormen, noble governors, still ruled their territories like small kings, and loyalty to the crown was thin, a matter of political convenience more than national sentiment. The Danes, those persistent Norse raiders, had, for the moment, pulled back, but the North Sea was never calm for long. Trade routes brought not just goods but gossip. England's wealthy monasteries, rich in gold and silver, were irresistible targets. Ethelred's court was small, his advisors few. Chief among them was Aelfher of Mercia, who saw the boy king as a chance to extend Mercian influence. Over time, other nobles would circle in, each with his own agenda, each whispering contradictory strategies into the ear of a young man desperate for direction. The murmuring monks. One of the central issues of Ethelred's early reign was his relationship with the church. Monastic reform was already in motion, spurred by earlier kings who sought to bring Benedictine order to England's many monasteries. But these reforms were slow, clerical, and administrative, everything that made for unexciting history, but deeply shaped the rhythm of everyday life. Monks wrote the laws. They preserved the king's image in Latin chronicles. They organized the royal charters that determined who owned which patch of forest or field. Ethelred's reputation, in large part, would be forged not in battle but in ink. It was during these years that the court began issuing law codes, not bold proclamations, but weary lists of expectations and fees. A stolen sheep here, a botched land transfer there. Each code tried to make sense of a kingdom too large to be known and too fragile to be ruled firmly. And then the Danes returned. The first payments. The raids began again in the 980s. At first they were small, swift strikes on monasteries along the south coast, but by 991 they had turned into full-scale incursions. At the Battle of Maldon, the English, led by Byrhtnoth, stood their ground. Byrhtnoth famously allowed the Viking forces to cross a causeway to fight fairly, a romantic gesture that ended in his death and a rout of the English. Rather than regrouping militarily, Ethelred turned to negotiation. He introduced what would become the defining feature of his reign: Danegeld attacks paid to the raiders to go away. It wasn't unprecedented, but Ethelred institutionalized it. In 991 he paid the first major sum, 10,000 pounds of silver. It worked briefly, but it set a precedent that would repeat over and over. By 1012, Danegeld payments would reach 48,000 pounds. Imagine the scribes, endlessly copying tax records, collecting silver from distant shires. Imagine the treasuries emptied and filled again through wearying collections. It was a policy not of defeat but of resignation, and it created an economy of fear, a rhythm of payout and plunder. An unready reputation. Ethelred's nickname was not used during his lifetime. It was the chroniclers who would later call him unread, not unready as in unprepared, but as in poorly advised. The irony is rich. His name, Ethelred, meant noble counsel. Thus, Ethelred Unread could be translated as noble counsel, no counsel at all. The heart of his failure lay in process. Every decision seemed delayed. Every campaign was slow to mobilize. Messages traveled slowly by horse over muddy roads. Allies hesitated. Armies gathered only to disband. Ethelred was no fool, but he governed as though he had more time than he did. It was, perhaps, the most defining trait of his reign, a kind of historical procrastination. The crown's heavy stillness. By the close of the first decade of Ethelred's rule, the kingdom was not in open collapse. It was something stranger, an extended stillness under the pressure of slow, compounding problems. The Danes hadn't conquered England yet. The nobles hadn't rebelled. The church still functioned. But beneath it all, the sense of dread was growing. No crisis was addressed completely. No reform was finished. No enemy was truly defeated. Ethelred himself remained physically distant from most affairs, cloistered in royal halls in Winchester or London, surrounded by whispering advisors and the ever-turning wheels of clerical documentation. In another context, his reign might have been remembered as one of restraint or patience. But as the pressures grew, patience looked more like paralysis. As the 11th century loomed on the horizon, the Kingdom of England stood like a poorly thatched roof appearing whole from a distance, but leaking from every seam. Beneath the surface of daily affairs, things were unraveling in slow, silent ways. It wasn't the kind of collapse that made for thrilling tales. It was a deterioration born of poor communication, uneven justice, and a policy that placed faith not in sword or scripture but in silver. This was the age of the Danegeld, and in it, Ethelred's England perfected the art of paying to delay the inevitable. A kingdom that paid its enemies. The Danegeld was not, as one might think, a last resort. For Ethelred it became policy. After the 10,000 pounds tribute in 991, more payments followed. 16,000 pounds in 994, 24,000 pounds in 1002, and so it continued. In each case, the agreement was simple. The Viking armies, having looted coastal towns and seized hostages, would accept English silver in return for a promise to leave. And they did leave briefly. But the payments created unintended consequences. They taught the Vikings two things: that England was rich and that it was willing to pay instead of fight. The silver filled Scandinavian war chests and funded more raids. Some Viking chieftains, like Thorkel the Tall, would return again and again, each time demanding more. In the heart of England, the Danegeld meant something else entirely: taxation. Every shire, every estate was assessed. Coin was collected from tenants and landlords, abbeys and merchants. For a realm only barely centralized, this was an enormous administrative burden. But England did it, over and over again, because the alternative full-scale war seemed worse. The scattered army. You might think that Ethelred had no military ambitions. That would be incorrect. He issued calls to arms more than once, but the system by which England raised troops the field was inefficient. Each region was expected to send a quota of men when summoned, but the logistics were cumbersome. Mustering points were far. Coordination was difficult. Messages traveled slowly and warships were scarce. In 992, Ethelred ordered a fleet to meet the Vikings at sea. The ships assembled, but before the fleet could engage, the commanders turned on one another. A man named Aelfric betrayed the king and fled to the Danes. The fleet scattered. The campaign collapsed before it began. This was not an isolated case. Similar failures would repeat themselves throughout Ethelred's reign. Even when the English navy was assembled, it was rarely effective. Often, they simply waited in harbor as the raiders bypassed them entirely. The army existed, on paper and in theory, but in practice, it was a disjointed collection of men with uneven loyalties and unclear command structures. A brutal miscalculation, the St. Brice's Day massacre. In the year 1002, Ethelred made one of the most decisive and disastrous choices of his reign. Convinced that Danish settlers in England were plotting against him, a rumor he likely heard from his closest advisors, he issued an edict. On the 13th of November, the feast of St. Brice, all Danes living in England were to be killed. It's hard to overstate the implications of this. These were not raiders. These were settlers' families, farmers, craftsmen. Many had lived in England for generations. They spoke Old Norse, yes, but they had intermarried, owned land, paid taxes. The massacre was unevenly carried out. In some towns, Danish communities were wiped out. In others, local officials hesitated or refused. But the message was clear. Ethelred's regime had chosen to turn against an entire ethnic group. Among those likely killed was Gunhilda, the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark. Her death would have consequences. Because of this act, the character of the Viking invasions shifted. No longer merely opportunistic, they now carried a motive for vengeance. Enter Sweyn Forkbeard. In 1003, Sweyn Forkbeard invaded. He didn't come to raid, he came to conquer. Over the next several years, his campaigns grew more ambitious. Towns were burned, nobles were captured. England's defenses wavered, especially in the east and south. Ethelred responded as he always had, with payments. The Danegelds continued £36,000 in 1007, £48,000 in 1012, and still the Vikings came. But what was Ethelred to do? His army was unreliable. His commanders had proven disloyal. The only tool he had was coin. And so, like a man patching a crumbling wall with mud, he kept paying. Hopping each silver coin would buy him one more quiet season. The role of Emma of Normandy. In 1002, around the time of the massacre, Ethelred made a strategic marriage. He wed Emma of Normandy, a noblewoman from across the Channel. This alliance was intended to secure continental support and discourage Viking alliances with the Normans, who were themselves descended from Norse settlers. Emma was young, possibly as young as 12, and brought with her a new courtly influence. She would become a significant figure in English history, though her full power wouldn't emerge until later. For now, she bore Ethelred several children, including the future King Edward the Confessor. But Emma's presence also caused friction. The old nobility distrusted her. She represented a different courtly culture, more continental, more polished. In a court already splintered by mistrust, her presence added one more competing interest. The slow collapse of confidence. By the 1010s, the mood in England had shifted. The people were tired. The nobility was divided. Viking armies had marched unopposed deep into the countryside. London had been threatened multiple times. Towns like Oxford and Canterbury had suffered. And Ethelred remained. He was not overthrown. He was not assassinated. But neither was he beloved. He ruled not through loyalty but inertia. He was the king because there was no one else yet. In 1013 that changed. Sweyn Forkbeard returned, this time with overwhelming force. Town after town submitted to him. London finally buckled. Even Emma and the royal children fled to Normandy. Ethelred, for the first time, was no longer king. Sweyn was declared King of England. It had happened not with a final battle, but through exhaustion. And then, in a twist of history, Sweyn died suddenly just 5 weeks later. A chance had opened. Ethelred returned from exile, but England was no longer the kingdom he had inherited as a child. A monarch in exile. While in Normandy, Ethelred had seen a different form of governance, one shaped by continental norms, tighter feudal ties, and stronger administrative control. But it was too late to adopt these lessons wholesale. His return to the throne in 1014 was not triumphant. It was conditional. The nobles agreed to support him if he ruled more justly. Ethelred agreed. But a generation of mismanagement, passive strategy, and internal divisions had left deep scars. A rival soon appeared in the form of Cnut, Sweyn's son. Once more Ethelred's government stalled. Battles were inconclusive. Armies failed to mobilize. Loyalties shifted. In 1016, after years of sporadic conflict and fatigue, Ethelred died quietly in London. He had reigned for 38 years. A reign defined not by dramatic events but by delay, not by defeat but by inaction, not by tyranny but by exhaustion. And yet the question remains, was Ethelred truly to blame for England's unraveling, or was he simply a man caught in a system too fragile to sustain its own weight? In 1016, the long, uneasy reign of Ethelred came to a quiet end. He died in London on April 23rd, during one of the most turbulent moments of English history. And yet, as with so much of his rule, his death was overshadowed not by glory or drama but by exhaustion, by uncertainty, and by a slow crumbling of systems that once promised strength. Ethelred had ruled for nearly 4 decades, a reign that stretched over 2 generations, and yet for all its length it was marked by a remarkable absence of resolution, a reign of intentions without completion, of threats answered with silver, of orders given but rarely followed. Let us now look not just at how his reign ended, but at what it left behind. The rise of Cnut and the end of a native dynasty. Ethelred's death did not solve England's crisis. Rather, it deepened it. His son, Edmund Ironside, immediately took up the mantle of resistance. Edmund, unlike his father, was a warrior by nature. He fought Cnut's forces across the country in a rapid and furious campaign. For the first time in years, an English king met the invaders head-on with consistent force. But the tide had already turned. Cnut commanded a unified, disciplined army backed by the momentum of prior victories and the disillusionment of English nobles. After a series of battles, including the indecisive yet brutal clash at Asandun, Edmund and Cnut agreed to divide the kingdom. Edmund would rule Wessex, Cnut would take the north and east. That compromise lasted only weeks. Edmund died suddenly and mysteriously in November of 1016, and with his death, the House of Wessex lost its final male heir in power. Cnut became king of all England. The line of Alfred the Great and of Ethelred faded into exile. A reign without closure. And yet, Ethelred's story doesn't quite end there. He left behind a legacy far more complex than his nickname suggests. His reign had not been marked by cowardice, nor by a lack of care. Rather, it was a case study in the dangers of administrative overload, poor delegation, and institutional rot. Ethelred had tried to govern. He issued more law codes than many of his predecessors combined. He sought to standardize currency, to centralize taxation, to issue consistent royal writs documents that would form the basis for English common law in later centuries. but his systems were undermined by factionalism, regional loyalties, and sluggish communication. His orders were often ignored or delayed. His authority existed more on parchment than in practice. It is easy to blame him entirely for the chaos that followed. But consider, Ethelred ruled during a time of enormous external pressure, when England was still learning what it meant to be a single kingdom rather than a patchwork of old tribal lands. He faced not just raids, but full-scale invasions by professional armies funded in part by the very silver his government had handed over. A kingdom on the verge of feudalism. Under Ethelred, England began its slow transformation toward what we now recognize as medieval feudal society. His rule saw the erosion of centralized power and the growing independence of great landholders. In place of royal protection, local lords increasingly became the power brokers in the countryside. They built private armies, administered justice, collected rents, and decided allegiances. In this way, Ethelred's reign marked the beginning of the lordship society that would dominate England for centuries to come. But unlike in France or the Holy Roman Empire, where feudal structures had long been entrenched, England's shift was awkward, caught between centralized kingship and local custom. Ethelred tried to straddle both. He relied on ancient Saxon loyalties and new administrative innovations, but they rarely worked in concert. As the king withdrew into his royal halls, the country decentralized, quietly, inevitably. The forgotten bureaucrats. One of the most interesting legacies of Ethelred's rule lies not in battles or kingship, but in bureaucracy. His court employed some of the most prolific scribes in Anglo-Saxon history. Under his rule, royal documents began to standardize language and form. The writ, a brief legal instruction from the king to a local official, became increasingly common. These were not grand proclamations, but small, practical orders: taxes to collect, fines to remit, land boundaries to confirm. It was the beginning of England's long tradition of written government. Even as the kingdom wobbled, it was learning how to govern on paper. The church, too, played its part. Monasteries became repositories of information, charter houses, legal centers. The priests and monks of Ethelred's era were more than spiritual leaders; they were civil servants in all but name. And this development would survive the Danish conquest. Indeed, Cnut himself would later rely on many of the same systems Ethelred built. Emma's legacy and the return of the House of Wessex. Ethelred's queen, Emma of Normandy, outlived him and played a pivotal role in shaping his legacy. After Ethelred's death, Emma married Cnut, the very man who had dethroned her late husband. She bore Cnut a son, Harthacnut, while her children by Ethelred, Edward, and Alfred remained in Normandy. This blending of dynasties, once scandalous, would later prove critical. After the death of Cnut's heirs, England once again looked to the old royal line. In 1042, Emma's son by Ethelred, Edward the Confessor, returned to claim the throne. It was Ethelred's blood that reemerged, quietly to rule again. And so, the story of the unready king gained a strange sort of coda. He had not destroyed the dynasty. He had merely buried it under years of hardship, only for it to reappear reborn through patience. A reflection in stillness. To sleep through history is, in some ways, to better understand it. Not all monarchs blaze with the fire of conquest or revolution. Some, like Ethelred, rule in the long shadows between such moments, in the heavy silence before the storm. His reign reminds us that history is not made only through action. It is also made through inaction, through waiting too long, through acting too late, through allowing systems to persist that no longer serve their purpose. England did not fall under Ethelred, but it drifted, and in drifting it lost its footing. And in that story there is a quiet lesson, one that lingers even now. Is it worse to act rashly or never to act at all? Story 2, The 100-Year Paper Trail. the English chancery's rise and routine. Imagine a long wooden table. A single window filters daylight across rolls of parchment stacked in neat bundles. Several men sit in plain woolen robes, their heads bent, dipping quills into iron gall ink. There are no swords here, no banners, just the steady scratching of pens on vellum. This was the heartbeat of medieval England, not on the battlefield, but in the chancery. You might never have heard of it, and yet the chancery's work shaped the very language of law, defined royal authority, and turned the English monarchy into a written institution. Over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, this office turned ink into power, one document at a time. Let's begin at the beginning, before the English chancery had a name, before its scribes wore robes, and before parchment was even common. Before the chancery, writing in the early kingdoms. In Anglo-Saxon England, writing was sacred and scarce. Most documents were written by monks, men who saw script as a divine practice. They copied the Bible, recorded sermons, and composed hagiographies. But slowly, kings began to use writing, not to preach, but to rule. The earliest royal documents were charters. These weren't dramatic proclamations, but practical instruments. A charter might grant land to a monastery or confirm a noble's rights. They began with invocations in the name of God, Amen, and ended with lists of witnesses, sometimes including the king's own mark. But these charters were produced irregularly. The king might call upon a local abbot to write one, or a bishop's clerk might do the job. There was no central office, no permanent staff. That would change. Norman order, the seeds of the chancery. After the Norman conquest in 1066, William the Conqueror brought with him not just soldiers, but scribes. The Normans had inherited Roman and Frankish traditions of governance, which relied heavily on documentation. Royal authority flowed not just from blood, but from paper writs, mandates, and seals. William established a more formal structure. He began issuing writs, short letters under seal that instructed sheriffs to carry out royal commands. These writs were produced by a growing class of royal scribes, likely working in the royal household. It was not yet a full chancery, but it was something close. What set this apart from earlier periods was consistency. The writs began to follow a template. They used set phrases. They referred to consistent laws. They were short, often fewer than 100 words, but they carried the full authority of the king. And they were stored, copied, referred to again. The habit of written governance had begun. The rise of the seal. One object more than any other defined royal authority in this period: the seal. The royal seal was a disc of wax, usually green or red, impressed with the king's image and name. It was affixed to documents to prove their authenticity. The king could not read every charter. He didn't need to. His seal did the work. Over time, seal keeping became an entire profession. The chancellor, a senior royal official, was entrusted with the king's seal. To misuse it was treason. To break it was sacrilege. By the reign of Henry I, 1100–1135, the role of the chancellor had grown. He was no longer just a keeper of the seal. He oversaw the production of royal documents, and under him worked an expanding staff: scribes, clerks, notaries. This was the English chancery in its infancy, a mobile office that traveled with the king, issuing documents in his name. It was boring work but essential. The chancery on the move. In the 12th century, there were no capital cities in the modern sense. The English court was peripatetic. It moved constantly. The king might be in Winchester in May, York in June, and Westminster by July, and the chancery moved with him. The scribes packed up their ink pots and parchment and followed the royal train. In castles, monasteries, or makeshift tents, they set up writing desks. Royal business continued wherever the king rested. But the chancery's records, its rolls, began to accumulate. The most important were the charter rolls, patent rolls, and close rolls. Charter rolls recorded formal grants of rights or lands. Patent rolls contained open letters, orders, or announcements meant to be read publicly. Closed rolls were letters folded and sealed meant for private delivery. Each roll was copied by hand. Each one was kept in the royal archive. Over time, they formed a kind of paper trail through the reign of each king, a detailed log of promises, commands, and negotiations. The language of authority. The scribes of the chancery did not write in English. They wrote in Latin, the language of the church and law. Their phrases were formal, repetitive, and difficult to translate, but that was the point. A royal charter might begin, "Sietes quod consedimus," know that we grant, and continue with a formulaic list of names, places, and conditions. These weren't just words, they were tools of governance. To use the correct formula was to assert legitimacy. To deviate from it was to invite challenge. This is one reason the chancery was so powerful. It created not just documents but precedent. Over time, the repetition of forms became law, and because the chancery kept copies, it could prove what had been said and done. In a world without printing presses or centralized courts, that kind of memory was revolutionary. The quiet power of the pen. You might imagine that chancery scribes were low-status clerks, but they were often highly educated, sometimes even noble-born. A position in the chancery could lead to high office. Many future bishops and judges began their careers copying writs. But the work was unglamorous. A scribe's day was long and repetitive. Draft the writ, copy it, proofread it, affix the seal, enter it on the roll. The tools were simple: quills trimmed by hand, ink made from oak galls, parchment scraped from calfskin. Errors had to be corrected by scraping the parchment, a delicate process. Too much pressure and the skin would tear. And yet from this labor came continuity. Laws were enforced, land disputes were settled, taxes were ordered, all through quiet rooms, scratchy pens, and the minds of men who knew how to structure a sentence. A century of paperwork. From the Norman conquest to the early 13th century, the English chancery grew from a loose collection of clerks into a full royal bureaucracy. By the time of King John, R. 1199-1216, the chancery was producing hundreds of documents each year. The records from John's reign, particularly the closed rolls, form one of the most detailed archives in early medieval Europe. But even as the chancery expanded, it remained mobile. Its staff carried heavy trunks of documents across muddy roads, through rain and wind, setting up writing desks in each new royal encampment. It was the silent partner to royal power, a ghost of governance that moved behind the throne. By the early 13th century, the English chancery had grown into something remarkable, not in size or spectacle, but in influence. Still invisible to most of the population, it had become the beating heart of a paper-based monarchy. Its clerks, scribes, and seals worked in the background of every royal decision. But bureaucracy does not live in a vacuum. As kings changed, wars erupted, and barons rebelled, the chancery continued to function not despite the chaos but through it. It adapted, documented, and at times constrained royal power. In doing so, it revealed a truth both boring and profound. Power that must be written down is power that can be questioned. This is the story of how documents began to shape kings, just as kings had once shaped documents. The office that moved with the king. It's important to understand that the chancery, even in its most powerful years, was not a building, it was a people. A writing staff, a few chests of rolls, and a seal. These could travel with the king wherever he went. The royal court was always on the move. At any time, the king might be in Westminster, Gloucester, or even the Welsh borders. And where he went, so too did the scribes. They traveled by horse, often across muddy tracks and forested trails, carrying leather satchels filled with parchment. When they arrived, they would unpack their supplies, set up wooden writing tables, and begin the daily work of monarchy, confirming charters, issuing writs, renewing land grants, and recording oaths. These were not dramatic events. They were the routines that kept the realm stable. But then came the instability. The anarchy, 1135–1153. After the death of King Henry I in 1135, England fell into civil war. Known as the Anarchy, this period saw a brutal succession crisis between Henry's daughter, Empress Matilda, and her cousin, Stephen of Blois. Castles were seized, nobles switched sides, famine spread. But even in this chaos, the chancery persisted fractured, yet still functioning. Each claimant to the throne maintained their own chancery. Stephen had one, Matilda had another. In contested regions, sheriffs received conflicting orders. Sometimes both sides issued nearly identical writs, each sealed, signed, and legally valid, depending on whom you believed was king or queen. The irony was rich. The more contested the authority, the more each side relied on paperwork to prove legitimacy. The scribes kept writing, documenting chaos with the same dry formality as if the realm were at peace. A charter from Stephen might begin, "Stephen, by the grace of God, King of the English." And another from Matilda would say, "Matilda, Empress and rightful Lady of the English." The chancery was no longer just recording royal, well, it was creating it. The chancellor, a cleric between church and crown. During this period, the position of chancellor grew more important. Originally a royal clerk who kept the king's seal, the chancellor had become a trusted advisor, often a high-ranking cleric, even a bishop. The chancellor oversaw document production and ensured the legal phrasing was correct. He decided what should be written and how. This role was powerful and political. Take Thomas Becket, perhaps the most famous chancellor. He served Henry II R 1154–1189 before becoming Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket helped professionalize the chancery, refining its record-keeping and document forms. But he also clashed with Henry over whether royal power should dominate the church. His martyrdom in 1170, murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, was one of the most famous events of the Middle Ages. But behind it lay years of bureaucratic tension. Becket had known that power did not lie solely in the sword, but in the wording of a writ. The expansion of written forms. By the late 12th century, the chancery's work became increasingly formalized. What had once been improvisational became standardized. Royal documents used strict templates, known as formularies, which clerks followed like recipes. For example, a typical land grant might include the arenga, a justification or preamble; the dispositive clause, what was being granted; the sanction clause, warnings against interference; the witness list, nobles or clergy present at the sealing. The repetition of these forms was dull but powerful. It created continuity. It allowed documents from different regions and decades to be read in the same language of law. It built the foundation for English legal tradition. And the chancery began to copy and store everything. The earliest charter rolls, from 1199 onward, preserved all charters issued by the king. The close rolls recorded private letters sent under seal. The patent rolls preserved open letters and appointments. These rolls were stored, often in chests, organized by regnal year. In time, they would become the basis for legal appeals, land claims, and historical records. The clerk's quiet revolution. Behind the growth of this system were hundreds of anonymous clerksmen who spent their lives hunched over desks, translating the king's decisions into Latin phrases, one line at a time. They worked long hours. Errors had to be scraped out by knife. Their workspace was lit by candlelight or daylight alone. Heating was rare. Silence was expected. They were not often rewarded with glory, but they were occasionally promoted to bishoprics or judicial posts. Some became chancellors, others faded into obscurity, their names preserved only in the witness lines of a forgotten land grant. Still, their work mattered, because without them the king's will could not be known, his taxes could not be collected, his judgments could not be enforced. These clerks didn't wield swords, but they shaped the kingdom all the same. Writing constraints on the crown. The more documents the chancery produced, the more evidence accumulated and the more precedent was set. This would soon have an unintended consequence for the monarchy: limits. In 1215, after years of disputes between King John and his barons, the chancery was forced to produce a document that would become legendary: Magna Carta. It was, in essence, a peace treaty, a written agreement that the king would follow certain rules. But it was also a bureaucratic document. Sealed, copied, and entered into the chancery's rolls, it was not meant to be symbolic. It was meant to be enforced. Clause after clause outlined practical limitations. No new taxes without baronial consent. No imprisonment without trial. Standard weights and measures. The king's court must be held in a fixed location. These clauses weren't written in poetry. They were written in legal prose shaped by scribes who knew how to make language bind a king. The chancery was no longer just recording power. It was beginning to balance it. By the dawn of the 13th century, the English chancery had become more than just a royal scribal office. It was now the nerve center of state administration, a place where documents didn't just describe power, they defined it. This section of our journey focuses on what came after the formalization of the chancery: the professionalization, the fixation on precedent, and the gradual but momentous shift from a kingdom ruled by men to a kingdom ruled by records. A shift so incremental, so mechanical, that few at the time fully realized what had changed. But change it did. The English monarchy was now reliant not just on armies or barons, but on the labor of invisible clerks, whose job was to maintain the most powerful tool in the kingdom: continuity. A new home, Westminster and the stationary chancery. In the years following the issuance of Magna Carta, 1215, the chancery began to settle. Where once it had followed the king from manor to castle to field tent, now it began to establish a permanent base in Westminster, a town growing in both religious and administrative importance. The abbey was already centuries old. Now, the records of the realm would find a home there as well. By the late 13th century, the chancery was no longer a roving scribal workshop. It was becoming a fixed institution, complete with a hierarchy of staff, official titles, and procedures. Documents were now dated not just by the place of issue, but with the location of the royal seal, often Westminster itself. This shift marked a new phase in governance. The English monarchy was beginning to separate its government from the person of the king, and paper made it possible. The bureaucratization of memory. One of the chancery's most important innovations was its relationship to memory. In a world where few could read and fewer still could afford to record anything, the chancery became a national memory bank. It stored the charter rolls from 1199, which preserved every formal royal grant; the close rolls from 1204, for sealed private letters; the patent rolls from 1201, for open letters and appointments; the fine rolls, which recorded payments made to the crown; the liberate rolls, detailing payments and provisions. These rolls were stored in wooden chests, large, iron-bound trunks called coffers. Over time, they would be referenced in lawsuits, appeals, and land claims. They were consulted by judges, barons, and even the king himself. Each roll was organized by regnal year, and clerks began to develop indexing systems to locate past entries, rudimentary versions of what we would now call an archive or database. This careful preservation gave rise to precedent. The practice of citing past rulings, grants, and writs as justification for present action. In other words, the Chancery gave English law a memory, and memory, once recorded, is difficult to undo. The language becomes law. As documents accumulated, their language hardened into custom. Phrases that had once been stylistic, like "know ye that we have granted," became legally significant. Courts began interpreting not just the intent of a document, but the formula it used. A misworded grant could be ruled invalid. A missing seal could nullify a writ. Even the spacing of lines, the inclusion of clauses, and the list of witnesses were scrutinized in legal disputes. This rigidity made clerks even more powerful. They weren't just transcribers. They were legal technicians, trained in the mechanics of royal power. A single missed clause could change a baron's fortune. And the language they wrote in. Still Latin, though, by the 14th century, French and eventually English would begin to appear. The role of the clerk. By now the Chancery staff had grown considerably. There were clerks of the rolls, responsible for maintaining each type of record. Scribes, who physically wrote and copied the documents. Clerks of the signet, who managed the king's personal seal. Notaries, who verified and authenticated documents. Archivists, who maintained the rolls and coffers. The office of chancellor was still the head of the chancery, often held by a senior cleric or bishop. But beneath him, a pyramid of labor kept the system running. These men worked in dim, cramped chambers, using goose quills, sand to dry ink, and parchment made from animal skin. Their tools were basic, but the system they maintained was astonishingly sophisticated. Each clerk knew how to phrase a royal charter, how to transcribe a confirmation of rights, how to file a land dispute, how to draft a tax writ. They worked not for fame but for order. They were, in the fullest sense, servants of the record. Unseen power and quiet resistance. As the Chancery became more entrenched, it also became a site of tension. Local lords often resented its authority. A charter issued in Westminster might override traditional rights in a faraway shire. Peasants and sheriffs alike found themselves beholden to documents they had never seen, written in a language they could not read, by men they had never met. But there were benefits too. The Chancery's regularization of landholding created security. Its tax writs allowed for more predictable levies. Its documentation of grants and pardons made arbitrary rule less likely, at least in theory. There were even moments of quiet resistance. Scribes occasionally inserted marginal notes, sarcastic, doubtful, or clarifying. Errors were sometimes introduced deliberately. And in one famous case, a charter was backdated in favor of a monastery, a forgery so convincing that it stood for centuries. In these small acts, we glimpse the human hands behind the institutional machine. Fallible, political, but still deeply devoted to the written word. A legacy written in ink. By the end of the 13th century, the Chancery had become a pillar of English government. It would persist for centuries, eventually splitting into various branches: Chancery courts, the Public Record Office, and the machinery of modern bureaucracy. But its roots were simple: wax seals, scribes, and scrolls. Its power lay in consistency. In a world of famine, war, and shifting kingship, the Chancery provided continuity. It was the keeper of what had been said, what had been promised, what had been done. In time, even Parliament would begin to keep minutes, inspired by Chancery habits. The idea that government must be recorded, reviewed, and preserved, this was not a democratic innovation. It was a bureaucratic one. The Chancery did not shout, it did not fight, it whispered. But it whispered in ink, and that ink never faded. So we end this story with a reflection. If a king's power must now be confirmed on parchment, then in the long stretch of history, is it not the pen and not the crown that endures? Story 3. The Dusty Roads of the Han Dynasty's Civil Service. If you were born in the western provinces of the Han Empire around 100 BCE, and you happen to be literate, patient, and not prone to rebellion, you might one day find yourself wearing plain hemp robes, hunched over a bamboo desk, copying legal codes by candlelight in a small, dusty office. This was the quiet fate of the Han civil servant, an invisible cog in one of the most durable bureaucracies the world has ever known. The Han dynasty did not build its greatness on war alone. It endured through paperwork, through tax ledgers, grain registers, promotion documents, and memoranda copied again and again, in a style of writing so formal it bordered on poetic. We'll travel through the creation and early structure of the Han civil service, an institution whose dullness masks its historic importance. For this was a society that believed not just in rule by law but in rule by form, filing, and function. The problem of distance. The Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, inherited a problem familiar to many empires. It was too big. Stretching from the Korean peninsula in the east to the deserts of Central Asia in the west, the Han Empire encompassed a mosaic of languages, cultures, and climates. And unlike earlier dynasties, which ruled largely by force and feudalism, the Han aspired to something more lasting: bureaucratic control. But how could a single emperor, seated in Chang'an, modern Xi'an, know what was happening in a grain warehouse 1,200 miles away? How could imperial edicts reach distant garrisons before being twisted by local warlords? The answer was the same one found later by the Normans and Plantagenets in England: clerks. From scholar to scribe, the civil service ideal. Confucianism, revived and reinterpreted under Emperor Wu of Han r. 140–187 BCE, gave moral weight to governance through virtue and scholarship. The ideal official was not a warrior or nobleman, but a learned man well read in the five classics, modest in manner, and skilled in writing. These men were called Chinese letter, originally a class of minor nobility, but increasingly recruited for bureaucratic skill. They were appointed to offices based not on birth, but on recommendation. Local governors were expected to nominate talented men of virtue and education to join the imperial bureaucracy. There were no formal exams yet. That system would come later, under the Sui and Tang dynasties. In the Han, the path to office was by referral and records, and once appointed, officials were assigned to one of hundreds of offices across the empire. The bureaucratic ladder. Han officials were ranked according to a system known as the 9 ranks, each tied to a specific salary paid in grain or coin. At the top were ministers and court officials. Below them came provincial governors, district magistrates, warehouse overseers, tax collectors, scribes, runners, and clerks. A common entry-level post was clerk of documents, whose job was to copy imperial edicts, transcribe local reports, and ensure accuracy in the vast tide of official writing. Scribes worked with bamboo slips tied together with cord, later silk, reserved for the most important records, and eventually paper, invented during the Han and revolutionizing information flow. Every record mattered. A missed figure in a tax ledger could lead to famine. An incorrect boundary description could spark a village feud. The smallest miswriting could, in theory, be punished with demotion or exile. The roads between records. Information moved across the Han Empire via a network of postal relay stations and dusty government roads, known as Dao, Chinese letter. These weren't grand highways. They were narrow paths worn smooth by horse hooves and government runners. Messengers carried bamboo tubes filled with scrolls, sealed with wax or clay. Each station along the way housed fresh animals, food, and scribes to assist the courier. It was a slow system. An imperial edict might take weeks to reach a frontier town. In winter, snow could halt the message entirely. And yet, the system worked. Orders arrived. Reports returned. The capital maintained some level of awareness over events hundreds of leagues away. In this way, the hand invented something extraordinary, a functional paper empire. The office and its tools. A typical bureaucrat in a provincial town might spend his day reviewing grain reports, resolving land disputes, or adjudicating small legal matters. The tools of his trade included brushes made from animal hair, ink sticks ground and mixed with water, wooden desks, usually low to the ground, seals carved from stone or bronze, used to validate documents, lamps or daylight, as most writing was done by hand and in silence. Clerks kept document ledgers, each report registered with a title, origin, and summary. Filed copies were bundled and stored in wooden cabinets or clay jars to protect from pests. The buildings themselves were often plain wooden offices with sloped roofs, windows of lattice and paper, and a courtyard where peasants would queue to present petitions. The work was routine, the stakes were high. Justice by filing. The hand bureaucracy was responsible not only for taxation and grain storage, but for law enforcement. Local magistrates handled most judicial matters: marriage registration, theft, boundary disputes, even homicide. Trials were swift and based on legal codes passed down from Qin and updated during Han rule. Clerks recorded accusations and testimonies, sentencing decisions, notices of appeal, records of flogging or execution, with witnesses noted. These records were copied and sent to higher authorities. A bureaucratic trail followed every case. In time, some magistrates became overwhelmed not by rebellion or crime, but by paperwork. The weight of ink and bamboo grew heavier than swords. When records became reality, an odd thing began to happen by the Middle Han period. The records began to shape reality. If a land deed showed you owned a plot, even if your family had lived there for generations, you could lose it. If a tax registry listed your household as 3 people, you owed tribute for 3, no more, no less. The system was fair on paper, but in practice it was uneven. Literacy was rare. The poor couldn't always contest decisions. Corrupt scribes could alter files or demand bribes. Still, the ideal persisted: a moral bureaucracy where written law guided action and scholars preserved justice. It is easy to imagine that an orderly bureaucracy brings peace and prosperity. But as the Han dynasty entered its later centuries, a peculiar problem began to emerge: not a failure of administration, but an excess of it. Too many rules, too many ledgers, too many clerks chasing too many minor infractions. The system that once knit the empire together began to suffocate it slowly, quietly, and thoroughly. This was not collapse through war or rebellion. It was something softer, a slow solidifying of processes, a calcification of forms, an empire where the answers to urgent questions were filed and then never retrieved. The bureaucrat's burden. In the early Han, a district magistrate might manage 5,000 households with the help of assistants and clerks. But by the 1st century CE, populations had grown and administrative divisions had not always kept pace. One official might now be expected to oversee more than 10,000 households, dozens of hamlets, and hundreds of miles of roads. The volume of daily paperwork increased accordingly. Tax receipts, grain reports, corvée labor rosters, petitions, census updates, requests for tools, punishments, livestock counts, death notices. To manage it, clerks created copies of copies. They filed and refiled. Each document required a formal response, often dictated from above. But communication was slow. A magistrate might wait weeks or months for an answer from the provincial capital. In the meantime, nothing moved. Officials began to delay decisions until approvals came. Villagers waited. Grain spoiled in warehouses. Roads fell into disrepair. The civil service had grown, but not always in wisdom. Promotion by paper. In the early Han period, an official's success was judged by results. Did the district remain peaceful? Were taxes collected? Was the harvest successful? But by the later hand, the criteria shifted. Success was measured in compliance. A good magistrate was one whose paperwork was complete, consistent, and perfectly formatted. Reports needed the correct preambles, the proper red seal, the correct line spacing. If a document lacked the correct heading or style, it was rejected. This encouraged a new type of official, the procedural expert, men who knew how to write the correct report, even if they had little knowledge of farming, irrigation, or local law. As one frustrated court historian later wrote, "They know how to write with elegance, but not how to feed the people." Corruption in the margins. In a world governed by written records, the ability to forge or manipulate those records became a powerful tool. Clerks, especially those underpaid or politically vulnerable, could be bribed to alter tax liabilities, backdate land deeds, destroy complaint petitions, insert fraudulent names into official rolls. This was not dramatic corruption. It was subtle. A single stroke of the brush could increase a peasant's debt or erase it. Senior officials often turned a blind eye, focusing instead on their own paperwork and promotion tracks. Investigations were rare unless triggered by major scandal. The sheer volume of documents made oversight difficult. As long as the numbers looked right, few questioned the content. The bureaucracy had become a system of trust without visibility. Edicts and their echoes. The emperor, still the supreme head of state, continued to issue edicts. These were often grand in tone, moralistic proclamations calling for virtue, harmony, and restraint. But these edicts traveled slowly and were often reinterpreted as they passed through each bureaucratic level. What began as a simple decree, reduce corvée labor by 10% this year, might become a complex set of instructions, modified by provincial governors, then district officials, then local headmen. By the time it reached a farmer, it might be misunderstood or ignored entirely. Some edicts were so convoluted by the time they arrived that scribes were hired just to interpret them. This phenomenon became known as edicts without echo, commands that never quite touched the ground. The bureaucratization of morality. Confucian ideals still infused the civil service. Officials were expected to embody li, ritual propriety, ren, benevolence, and yi, righteousness. In theory, a magistrate should be a model of virtue. But in practice, these virtues became checklists. Officials were evaluated not just on grain collection, but on how well they performed ceremonial rites, how their letters addressed the emperor, whether they fasted appropriately before memorials. The line between moral behavior and bureaucratic performance blurred. A failure to perform a ritual correctly could lead to demotion, even if the official was effective in governance. Some scholars began to question the system itself. Was the state upholding virtue or simply enforcing conformity? The case of Du Bao, a model clerk. Du Bao, a district officer in the year 147 CE, became famous not for military deeds or political boldness, but for his methodical attention to record-keeping. He invented a color-coded tagging system for bamboo files, introduced monthly reporting summaries, and even kept an index of how many complaints were resolved versus deferred. His district ran smoothly, if unremarkably. He was promoted several times, rising to provincial auditor, where he implemented his filing methods across 3 provinces. Later dynasties would copy his approach. Yet Du Bao never became famous. His work was dry, methodical, and slow, but it endured long after louder men had vanished from the court. Administrative exhaustion. By the 2nd century CE, the Han bureaucracy was overextended. Officials rotated frequently to prevent corruption, but this led to loss of institutional memory. A new magistrate might spend a year just understanding local records, then be transferred before any reforms could take hold. Some simply gave up. Others withdrew emotionally, completing the minimum paperwork and leaving local problems unsolved. A few retired to monasteries or rural retreats, leaving ghost offices in their wake. The result was what historians now call administrative exhaustion, a slow-moving burnout that hollowed out the structure from within. So we pause at this point, as the empire begins to sag not from war or disaster, but from the weight of its own structure. Can an empire become so organized that it forgets how to act, or is that precisely what keeps it from breaking apart altogether? By the end of the 2nd century CE, the Han dynasty was teetering. The emperor's authority had waned. Eunuchs at court wielded unchecked power. Warlords in the provinces ignored imperial orders. And yet, despite the growing disorder at the top, the bureaucracy kept filing reports. Grain taxes were still collected. Census records were still submitted. Cases were still tried in village offices. It was as though the system refused to acknowledge collapse even as the empire it supported began to fragment. This final section tells the story of how the Han civil service outlasted the very state it was designed to serve, how it laid the groundwork for dynasties to come, and how bureaucracy itself became China's most enduring political institution. The fall in slow motion. The Han Empire did not fall in a single year. It decayed. The seeds of instability were many. Widening gaps between rich and poor. Powerful landowners exempting themselves from taxes. A bloated and tired bureaucracy, more focused on procedures than reform. Court intrigue and factionalism. Rebellion sparked by famine and injustice, most famously the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE. And yet, in the face of all this, local governance persisted. In counties far from the capital, scribes continued to draft edicts. Officials sent their forms up the chain. Peasants paid taxes, filed disputes, and petitioned their magistrates even as bandits roamed nearby. There is something oddly comforting about this. A civil service so deeply embedded that it survived its empire's political will. Legacy in the records. Some of the most detailed administrative records from the Han come not from palace halls, but from abandoned frontier post places where officials had once worked in obscurity, managing distant corners of the empire. These include grain inventories with entries down to the last due, a unit of volume, tax receipts stamped with clay seals and tied in bundles, memorials to superiors requesting additional scribes or more ink, personal letters between clerks worrying about promotions, family illness, or the cost of paper. These records, buried for centuries and recovered from dry deserts and tombs, paint a vivid picture of human bureaucracy, imperfect, repetitive, but deeply committed to its function. Through them, we hear the voices not of emperors, but of men with ink-stained sleeves and worn brushes. The rebirth of civil examination. Although the Han dynasty collapsed in 220 CE, the Confucian ideal of civil service did not. Successor regimes, including the Cao Wei Jin and eventually the Tang dynasty, would preserve and transform the administrative model. In fact, the imperial examination system, which later became the hallmark of Chinese governance, emerged directly from Han experimentation. Where the Han had relied on recommendation for civil appointments, later dynasties formalized a system of written exams, rigorous tests based on the Confucian classics, poetry, and administrative law. This shift redefined what it meant to be elite. No longer just noble birth or military might, now knowledge, memory, and the ability to write in a precise style could elevate a man to high office. And so, long after the Han disappeared, its ideals survived in testing halls, filing offices, and the belief that a scholar could rule better than a soldier. The scholar-bureaucrat, an enduring archetype. The Han created more than policies and departments. It created a figure, the Junzi Chinese letter, or gentleman official. Quiet, restrained, literate. A man who served not for fame or riches but to uphold order and virtue. This archetype would become central to Chinese history. In painting, literature, and folklore, the ideal official was calm, just, and emotionally measured. His weapons were the brush, not the sword; the scroll, not the spear; the seal, not the scepter. This image endured because the Han institutionalized it not through myth but through daily habit. Offices trained men to speak softly, to file things properly, to correct others' errors with red ink rather than force. Over time, this mindset embedded itself into the culture. Children learned that to serve the state was honorable. To study, to write, to master the classics, these were the paths to greatness. When bureaucracy becomes civilization, the real legacy of the Han civil service was not in tax revenues or court cases. It was in showing that bureaucracy itself could be a civilizing force. Through its scribes and officials, the Han unified legal standards across vast distances, promoted the idea that the state should act according to moral ideals, valued literacy and administration over lineage and violence, left behind thousands of pages of documentation that preserved memory across centuries. Even when power passed to generals, usurpers, or foreign dynasties, the civil service remained. And that is perhaps the quietest revolution of all, that institutions, not rulers, carry the weight of civilization. So as we close this story of roads, records, and ritualized governance, we leave with a thought written not in ink, but in practice. Is it possible that true stability lies not in strength, but in structure, in systems that endure even when kings fall silent? Story 4: Napoleon's Calendar Reform. How the French lost 10 days. In 1793, amidst the chaos of revolution, guillotines, and shouted calls for liberty, a much quieter revolution took place. It didn't involve bloodshed or barricades. Instead, it involved dates. The French government, radicalized by years of upheaval, declared that the old calendar, the Gregorian one, with its saints, days, and Christian structure, was a relic of tyranny and superstition. In its place, they introduced the French Republican calendar, a system so meticulously rational, so relentlessly mathematical, that it seemed designed more for machines than for men. This is the story of how France tried to restructure time itself, not in a dramatic battle, but in bureaucratic stillness, through renamed months, decimal time, and forgotten festivals of reason. It was, perhaps, the most orderly failure in revolutionary history. Revolutionary context: a war on the old world. By the early 1790s, revolutionary France had dismantled much of the ancient regime. The monarchy was gone. The church's power had been gutted. New institutions, constitutions, and civic values were being stamped out across every province. But one relic of the old world remained stubbornly intact: the calendar. The Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582 and used across Europe, was deeply Christian. The weeks honored saints. Months were named after Roman gods or emperors. The year began on January 1st, a date chosen for religious, not rational reasons. To the revolutionaries, this was unacceptable. If the world was to be reborn, then time itself had to be made revolutionary. And so, on 5 October 1793, the National Convention officially replaced the Gregorian calendar, with the calendrier Républicain retroactive to 22 September 1792, the founding of the French Republic. How the new calendar worked. The French Republican calendar was nothing if not thorough. Months. The year was divided into 12 months of 30 days each. Each month had a poetic, seasonal name in French. Autumn, vendémiaire, grape harvest; brumaire, mist; frimaire, frost. Winter, nivos, snow; pluvios, rain; ventos, wind. Spring, germinal, germination; Floreal flowers, prairial meadows. Summer messidor harvest, thermidor heat, fructidor fruits. Weeks. Each month was divided into 3 decades, 10-day weeks, eliminating the traditional 7-day week. This meant that Sunday was abolished, as were all Christian holidays. Days of the week were simply named: primidi, duodi, tridi, quartidi, quintidi, sextidi, septidi, octidi, nonidi, decadi. Extra days. 5 or 6 additional days were added at the end of each year to complete the solar cycle. These were called sansculatides, later renamed Fert Republicans, and were national holidays. Each day was also renamed not after saints, but after agricultural tools, animals, or crops. Instead of St. Joseph's Day, you might find Day of the Turnip. Decimal time, dividing the day differently. As if changing the year wasn't enough, the revolutionaries also introduced decimal time. Each day was to be divided into 10 hours, each hour into 100 minutes, and each minute into 100 seconds. Clocks were redesigned, dials were redrawn, public buildings installed dual clocks, 1 decimal, 1 standard. Decimal time, in theory, allowed for easier division of the day. It was rational, elegant, and almost instantly unpopular. Most people had no access to decimal clocks. The conversion was confusing. Farmers especially struggled. How do you plant by the sun if noon is now 5? Within 2 years, decimal time quietly vanished, but the calendar persisted. Administrative enforcement. The new calendar was not optional. Courts, schools, tax records, military orders, and government offices were required to use it. Marriage licenses, death certificates, and legal contracts had to be dated according to the new months and decades. Officials published conversion charts. Wall calendars were printed with decorative motifs showing the new months, and schoolchildren were taught to memorize the new system. But confusion reigned. Peasants still used the old saints' days. Merchants wrote both dates. Some priests secretly held Mass on Sundays, calling it decadi. Civil servants, unsure of which calendar to use, sometimes wrote both one above the other. Historians later noted that bureaucracy didn't abolish habit, it merely layered new habits over old ones. A quiet resentment. To revolutionary leaders, the calendar was symbolic, a victory of reason over superstition. To many others, it was an unnecessary complication. Market days, once regular, were thrown off schedule. The 10-day week meant fewer rest days. Farmers worked longer between breaks. Christian festivals were stripped from public life, replaced by abstract virtues like justice or fraternity. Time became impersonal, stay-toned, and ironically confusing. The French people did not revolt against the calendar. They simply ignored it, especially outside urban centers. In Paris, city clocks rang for decadi, but in the countryside, Sunday bells still tolled quietly. Napoleon enters the scene. By 1799, the Directory, the government that had enforced the calendar, fell. In its place rose a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who promised stability. Napoleon didn't abolish the calendar immediately. In fact, he even used it to signal his revolutionary credibility. Early imperial decrees still bore dates like 12 Brumaire, year VIII. But by 1805, the contradictions were too many. France was Catholic again. Napoleon had signed a concordat with the Pope. Trade with the rest of Europe used the Gregorian calendar. Even his own ministers were dating letters using both systems. On 1 January 1806, Napoleon officially restored the Gregorian calendar. There was no protest, no drama, only a quiet administrative switch. The French people, having lived under the Republican calendar for 13 years, lost 10 days and returned to the old rhythm, as if the experiment had never happened. The calendar was changed, the edicts passed, and the clocks were drawn, but life did not suddenly shift with the revolution's command. For ordinary people across France, farmers, merchants, clerks, and priests' time remained stubbornly lived, not legislated. The French Republican calendar, though elegant in design, was often out of step with weather, custom, and convenience. And so, the grand machinery of temporal reform began to grind slowly against the gears of everyday life. This is the story of what it was like to live inside the new calendar, not at the level of government policy, but on the ground, in villages, bakeries, vineyards, and town halls. It is a story not of dramatic resistance, but of shrugs, confusion, and paperwork. The problem of the decade. The abolition of the 7-day week, so central to European life, since antiquity created one of the most immediate difficulties. The Republican calendar replaced it with the decade, a 10-day week. Instead of Sunday, every 10th day, decadi, became the new day of rest and civic celebration. But this caused a reduction in rest days, one rest every 10 days instead of 7. Disruption to traditional market cycles, which were based on 7-day intervals. Confusion over festival timing and religious observances, which had long been linked to saints, days, and Sundays. Peasants in particular struggled. The new rest day didn't always align with their market or church traditions. In many towns, workers simply took both the old Sunday and the new decadi off, defeating the purpose entirely. Even revolutionary officials noted that le peuple s'y repose 2 fois au pas du tout, the people rest twice, or not at all. Fêtes sans saints, the new celebrations. The Republican calendar replaced religious holidays with festivals of reason, labor, and nature. Each day of the year was associated not with a saint but with a plant like the barley or the yew, an animal like the trout or the pigeon, a tool like the plow or the churn. This system, developed by poet Faber de Glantine, was meant to honor work in the natural world. It was poetic, symbolic, and difficult to memorize. Instead of Christmas, you had the festival of the dog. Instead of All Saints' Day, perhaps Pumpkin Day. The idea was to strip time of religious sentiment and replace it with rational beauty, but it did little to inspire awe. Many simply ignored the new names. Farmers laughed at the idea that a government in Paris could tell them what day was best to celebrate the spade. Administrative friction. In civil offices, the transition was tedious. Tax records had to include conversion dates. Legal documents required dual dating, 10 Thermidor, year VIII, 29 July 1800. Provincial bureaucrats requested additional paper stock to handle the longer forms. Errors were common. Letters arrived dated frimaire when they were sent in pluviose. Even in Paris, ministries employed clerks solely to convert dates between Republican and Gregorian calendars. One official in 1802 wrote in frustration, "I spend more time checking what day it is than deciding what must be done." This quiet administrative fatigue was not revolutionary. It was simply inconvenient. The church waits it out. The Catholic Church, formally suppressed during the radical phase of the Revolution, never fully accepted the calendar. When the Concordat of 1801 restored certain religious freedoms, the Church simply returned to the old rhythm without asking permission. Mass resumed on Sundays. Feast days were observed as before. Sermons were dated using the old liturgical calendar. Even in areas where government officials enforced Republican dates, priests would quietly correct them from the pulpit. A marriage license might say Quintidi Ventos year X, but the priest might whisper, Sunday, the 6th of March. Parishioners understood. In rural France, memory was stronger than legislation. The urban-rural divide. In cities like Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux, the Republican calendar was more visible. Public buildings posted conversion charts. Official bulletins used only Republican dates. Schools drilled children on the new months and days. But in villages, change came slower. A farmer in Normandy might still sow his field according to saints' feast days. A vintner in Burgundy might track his harvest by the old Julian moon. Historians note that in many rural communes, the Republican calendar was never fully adopted. It remained a thing of government forms, not community life. One mayor of a small alpine town reportedly kept two wall calendars, Gregorian for practical use, Republican for official business. When asked which he preferred, he said, "I use one to work and one to answer letters from Paris." The turn to the ordinary. As Napoleon gained power, he emphasized order, stability, and tradition. He wore the cloak of the revolution but governed like a monarch. He understood that calendars were not just tools, they were symbols. The Republican calendar had become a symbol of instability, not efficiency. It reminded citizens of the radical years, the terror, dechristianization, uncertainty. And so Napoleon began to de-emphasize it. Military dispatches began including Gregorian dates first. Court proceedings quietly reverted to the old system. Schools dropped lessons on the Republican months. By 1805, the calendar was only formally used in official state documents. Most people, including government officials, ignored it entirely. The following year, it was abolished. No great farewell. The end came not with protest, nor celebration. On 22 Fructidor year XIII, 9 September 1805, Napoleon signed a decree restoring the Gregorian calendar. On 1 January 1806, France officially returned to normal time. There was no ceremony, no speech. Calendars were quietly swapped. Record books adjusted headings. The date was simply different. And so, with the stroke of a pen, 10 years of revolutionary time were erased not with resistance, but with relief. The French Republican calendar lasted for just over 12 years. In that brief lifespan, it restructured the way an entire country recorded time. It renamed every month. It broke up the week. It erased saints and installed wheat sheaves. It tried to make time mathematical, secular, and symmetrical. And then it was gone. But even in its failure, it left behind questions that continue to echo through history. Can a nation truly reprogram its most basic habits? Is time something we use, or something we belong to? This final section explores the calendar's legacy not just in dates, but in philosophy, policy, and human limitation. What remained after abolition? When the Gregorian calendar was restored in 1806, France picked up right where it left off. Sunday returned as the day of rest. Christian holidays reappeared on public calendars. Schools began using traditional season and festivals again. But a few traces of the Republican system quietly persisted. For example, the metric system, introduced during the same period, survived. It too had been born from revolutionary rationalism, and it proved more adaptable. Some agricultural references, like Thermidor, remained in cultural memory. The Thermidorian reaction, marking the fall of Robespierre, is still used by historians today. In certain archival records, Republican dates were retained, especially in legal documents from the 1790s. Historians still translate them. The calendar may have disappeared from walls, but not from footnotes. Time as a tool of power. The French Republican calendar wasn't the first time a state tried to redefine time, and it wouldn't be the last. Rulers have always understood that controlling the calendar is a way to control narrative and memory. When Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 46 BCE, it was meant to stabilize agriculture and honor Rome's civic cycle. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed it in 1582, it was partly to restore the correct date of Easter. The French revolutionaries went further. They didn't just adjust the year, they tried to redefine what time meant. Time became not a spiritual order but a civic one, not sacred but stay-toned. In doing so, they revealed the limits of power. A government can change the law, enforce the format, rewrite the documents, but it cannot easily change habit, memory, or emotion. Echoes in the 20th century. A century later, other revolutions would attempt similar feats. Soviet Russia introduced a 5-day workweek, the Neprarivka in 1929, breaking up the 7-day religious cycle. Each day was color-coded, and rest days were rotated. Fascist Italy explored reforms to centralize feast days around the state. Maoist China considered calendar revision during its early communist period. In each case, the intent was the same: to align time with ideology, to erase the past and inaugurate a new present. And in each case, the result was the same: confusion, fatigue, and eventual reversal. The French experiment, in its quiet failure, served as a warning. Calendars are not just systems, they are invisible rituals. And rituals, once formed, do not break easily. The calendar as culture. The French Republican calendar didn't fail because it was poorly designed. In many ways, it was brilliant. Its months reflected seasonal realities. Its days honored nature and labor. It stripped time of superstition and returned it to the soil. But it ignored one simple truth: time is not only logic, it is tradition. People organize their lives not just around crops, but around weddings, funerals, birthdays, holidays, holy days, anniversaries. These are markers of belonging, not utility. You don't remember the 10th of Messidor when your child is born. You remember July because July is shared. This, in the end, was the Republican calendar's undoing. It spoke to the mind but not to the heart. A legacy of precision and a reminder of limits. Still, the Republican calendar remains a fascinating symbol of how far humans will go to reorder the world. It represents the ambition of Enlightenment logic, the reach of bureaucratic enforcement, the fragility of tradition in the face of upheaval, and ultimately, the resilience of habit. In its orderly names and decimal ambitions, we see the eternal struggle between rationalism and ritual, between the dream of clean systems and the mess of human reality. Even now, some horologists and historians argue for calendar reform. A 13-month year of 28 days each. A world calendar with fixed days. A return to lunar cycles. But these proposals rarely move beyond theory because time is no longer simply managed. It is lived, and living habits rarely yield to edicts. So we end this story with a final meditation. If time is measured not by clocks but by memory, can we ever truly rewrite the calendar or only copy it into new forms, hoping we remember where we began? Story 5, The Great Drainage, How the Dutch Fought Marshland Inch by Inch. When you picture the great battles of history, you might imagine armies, maps, and kings. But the Dutch have always had a different kind of enemy: water. Not waves from distant navies, but tides, rain, rivers, and floods that crept in silently, persistently, and with a kind of timeless authority. The Netherlands, after all, is named for its geography. Nederlanden, low lands, a flat, marshy delta where land and water are in constant negotiation. At times, the sea claimed fields and villages. At others, the people pushed it back, one ditch, dike, and drainage canal at a time. This story begins not with a heroic moment, but with mud, buckets, and a people who decided that land was not a gift, but something to be built, managed, and maintained forever. The geography of fragility. Much of the Netherlands lies at or below sea level. The land is flat and sedimentary, shaped over millennia by the mouths of rivers like the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt, which deposit rich silt as they empty into the North Sea. This fertile land came at a price. Spring floods, autumn storms and rising tides regularly overwhelmed early settlements. In some places, the sea simply moved in, forming inland bays or swallowing entire villages. One of the most infamous examples is the Zuiderzee, a shallow inland sea that was once dry land before it was overwhelmed by floods in the 13th century. To live in this region meant to accept that stability was never guaranteed. And so, over centuries, the Dutch began to build not just homes and towns, but systems to hold the water at bay. Turpin, the first resistance. As early as 500 BCE, communities in the northern Netherlands began building turpin artificial mounds of earth raised above flood levels. Villages, farms, and even churches were constructed atop these human-made hills. A turp might be only a few meters high, but that height could mean survival during seasonal floods. Over time, some turpin were enlarged and reinforced with stone or timber. They were not elegant, they were not beautiful, but they were functional. Even today, you can find turp villages, slightly elevated above the surrounding fields, remnants of a time when elevation was everything. The medieval drainage movement. By the 10th century CE, as populations grew and agriculture expanded, the Dutch began turning marshes into arable land. This process, called reclamation, was slow, communal, and deeply technical. Villages built dikes, earthen walls reinforced with clay and reed matting to hold back rivers and seas. Then they dug canals to drain the wetlands and funnel water into controlled outlets. The reclaimed land, called a polder, was then used for farming. Each polder was not a plot of land but a living system. It required constant drainage, since the land was lower than the water table, regular dike inspections and maintenance, shared management, as one failure could flood many farms. In this way, the Dutch learned early that survival required collective governance, and that freedom often came with communal obligation. Water boards, democracy for the ditch. To manage their growing network of polders and dikes, the Dutch invented one of the oldest forms of democratic administration in Europe, the waterschap, or water board. Water boards were local governing bodies responsible for maintaining water infrastructure. They collected taxes, enforced rules, and coordinated labor for dike repair, canal cleaning, windmill operation, flood response. Membership often included landowners, farmers, and engineers. Decisions were made by vote, and budgets were transparent. The earliest known water board, de Hoogheemraadschap van Rijnland, dates back to 1255 and still exists today. In a world dominated by kings and nobles, these modest boards of ditch inspectors were a quiet revolution, a governance born of mud and necessity. Windmills, the engines of reclamation. The Dutch are famous for their windmills, and rightly so, but these were not quaint tourist attractions. They were machines, and their purpose was clear: to move water. In the 15th century, windmill technology advanced to allow mechanical pumping. These polder mills used rotating blades to lift water from low-lying fields into drainage canals. With wind power, the Dutch could drain deeper polders, reclaiming land that was once thought lost forever. Each windmill had a miller, responsible for monitoring the water level, adjusting the sails, and maintaining the gears. The work was quiet but essential. A windmill that failed during a storm could result in a flooded village. Over time, windmills became as common as church spires, monuments not to faith, but to resilience. The battle that never ends. What makes the Dutch drainage project so remarkable is not its ingenuity, but its permanence. The sea never stops rising, rivers never stop swelling, rain never stops falling. And so every canal must be cleared, every dike must be inspected, every sluice gate must be tested, every pump must be maintained. Generations of Dutch citizens have been raised with the knowledge that their land exists only because someone, somewhere, is managing water. There is no victory, only maintenance. By the 17th century, the Netherlands was not just surviving, it was thriving. The small, soggy patchwork of land reclaimed from the sea had become a maritime empire. Canals were not only for drainage, but for commerce. Cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam boomed with trade. And yet, amid the riches of the Dutch Golden Age, the quiet war against water continued. More land was needed for crops, homes, roads, and trade. But there was only one way to get it: drain the sea. This period saw some of the most sophisticated and large-scale land reclamation efforts in human history, not dramatic, not violent, but slow, bureaucratic, and relentless. Polders on a grand scale. Earlier polders had been small and local, a few farms here, a village there. But in the 17th century, the Dutch began to organize regional-scale drainage operations, often backed by investors, merchants, and engineers. One of the most famous examples was the Beemster polder, drained between 1607 and 1612. The Beemster had been a shallow lake, regularly flooding nearby lands. Engineers used 43 windmills to pump water from the lake into surrounding canals. The drained lakebed became rich farmland, laid out in a perfect grid, a model of Dutch rational planning. Today, the Beemster is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not because of drama, but because of its quiet, systematic geometry. This was the new model: investment-driven reclamation, precision land division, and long-term maintenance. The role of the engineer: men like Jan Leegwater. While water boards managed local infrastructure, the engineer became the new hero of Dutch landmaking. One such figure was Jan Leegwater, a millwright and hydraulic engineer who helped oversee the Beemster project and later proposed plans to drain the even larger Haarlemmermeer Lake, which would eventually be completed 2 centuries later. Leegwater's name, ironically meaning empty water, became associated with the ideal of the rational, methodical Dutch engineer, part scientist, part administrator, part philosopher. He kept journals of windmill placement, water levels, soil quality, and pump designs. His work was precise, repetitive, and incremental, but over time it altered geography. The Netherlands did not conquer new territory through warfare. It invented it, organized it, and then kept it from disappearing. The cost of control. Reclaiming land wasn't cheap. Windmills required constant maintenance and favorable winds. Dikes eroded and had to be reinforced. Polder lands sank slowly over time, compacting under their own weight and requiring even deeper pumping. This led to a subtle but significant phenomenon. The Dutch were literally sinking the more they reclaimed. As peat soil dried and compressed, parts of the country dropped below sea level, making future floods even more dangerous. This feedback loop meant that the success of drainage increased vulnerability. And yet the Dutch pressed on, because there was no alternative. Floods and failure. Even the best systems can break. In 1570, the All Saints flood drowned over 20,000 people. In 1651, the St. Peter's flood breached multiple dikes in Zeeland. Each major flood was followed not by abandonment, but by reconstruction. Water boards reviewed failures, reinforced dikes, added new sluices, and raised embankments. Engineers began developing summer dikes to manage high rainfall and winter dikes for storm surges. The Dutch learned from each failure but never stopped building. In fact, each flood became a mandate for improvement, not a reason to retreat. Urban expansion on water. Cities were not exempt from this constant management. Amsterdam expanded in concentric rings, its famed canal belt built not for aesthetics but for drainage and transport. Delft, Leiden, and Haarlem constructed elaborate sewer and drainage systems, alongside their growing textile industries. Every house, warehouse, and church was built atop wooden pilings, driven into the soft, waterlogged soil. Urban development required surveyors, inspectors, and maintenance crews. Every expansion meant more canals to dredge, more levees to check, more locks to calibrate. And yet the cities grew slowly, deliberately, and almost always below sea level. Water as identity. By the 18th century, the Dutch relationship with water was no longer just practical. It had become cultural. Children learned about dikes and windmills as symbols of pride. Painters like Jacob van Ruisdael portrayed serene polder landscapes flat, orderly, conquered. Maps of the Netherlands showed the intricate veins of canals and waterways with almost anatomical precision. Even Dutch proverbs reflected the struggle. God created the world, but the Dutch created Holland. It was not a boast of conquest, but a quiet acknowledgement of labor. Their national story was not built in battles, but in maintenance schedules, water levels, and pump rotations. A daily practice of survival. By this time, the Dutch understood that they could never stop. If a windmill broke, the polder could flood. If a dike wasn't inspected, seepage could become a breach. If a canal clogged, drainage would back up for miles. Survival was not a product of brilliance, it was a product of repetition. Every town had dike wardens, sluice keepers, ditch diggers, and clogged canal inspectors. These were not glamorous jobs, but they were essential. And over centuries, this endless repetition became not just policy but practice, habit, and identity. The 19th and 20th centuries brought extraordinary changes to the world: industrial revolutions, modern warfare, global communication. But in the Netherlands, the core task remained the same: keep the water out. What changed were the tools, the scale, and the stakes. This final section traces how the Dutch drainage effort matured into a national infrastructure, a technological marvel, and a model of bureaucratic persistence still built on the same principles as centuries past: shared labor, patient planning, and the refusal to surrender a single inch to the sea. From wind to steam and beyond. By the early 1800s, windmills were no longer sufficient to handle the depth and scale of Dutch drainage needs. Water tables were rising. Peatlands had sunk further. Polders were deeper and wider than ever. Enter the steam engine. One of the earliest and most ambitious applications of steam in Dutch water management came in the form of the Haarlemmermeer Polder project, the long-envisioned plan to drain the Haarlem Lake, which by then threatened to swallow cities like Leiden and Amsterdam. The project took place between 1849 1852, employed 3 massive steam pumps, including the now famous Cruquius pumping station, still preserved today as a museum. Successfully drained 170 square kilometers of water, creating what is now the Haarlemmermeer municipality, home to Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, which sits 4 meters below sea level. The pumps were enormous, but the philosophy was unchanged: mechanical repetition, steady vigilance, and constant oversight. The flood of 1953, a national reckoning. Even with modern machinery, failure remained a threat. On the night of 31 January 1953, a powerful North Sea storm combined with a high spring tide to breach multiple dikes in the southwest Netherlands. Over 1,800 people died. 72,000 evacuated. More than 150,000 hectares flooded. Tens of thousands of livestock drowned. It was the worst flood in modern Dutch history. But the response was not panic, it was planning. Within months, the Dutch government launched the Delta Works project, an enormous system of dams, sluices, storm surge barriers, and movable gates, designed to fortify the southwestern coast against future disasters. This was engineering on a national scale, designed not to conquer water, but to negotiate with it forever. The Delta Works, engineering for centuries. The Delta Works is often called one of the seven wonders of the modern world, but it was never intended as a spectacle. It was intended to last. The project included the Oosterscheldekering, a massive storm surge barrier with movable gates. The Meeslantkering, a pair of giant swinging arms near Rotterdam that can close off the Nieuw waterway in the event of storm surge. Dozens of reinforced dikes, locks, and monitoring stations. Unlike past efforts, the Delta Works were built with the next 100 to 200 years in mind. And yet, like all Dutch water systems, they still require routine maintenance, real-time monitoring, and scheduled inspection. Because in the Netherlands, no engineering project is ever finished. The water boards today. The ancient waterschappen, the water boards still operate today. There are 21 regional water authorities, each independently elected. They manage water levels, test dike integrity, maintain treatment plants, and oversee ecological zones. Their budgets are transparent, their decisions are technical, their work is rarely noticed unless it fails. They are, in effect, democracy's ditch diggers. Every year, residents pay a small water management tax, not dramatic, not optional, just part of living on land that shouldn't exist. And that is perhaps the most profound truth of the Dutch system. Nothing is left to luck. Living below the line. Today, over 26% of the Netherlands is below sea level, and nearly 60% of the population lives in flood-prone areas. Despite climate change, rising seas, and increasing rainfall, the Dutch are not panicking. They are planning. Initiatives like Room for the River are redesigning landscapes to absorb floods rather than resist them. Urban planners coordinate with water engineers. Farmers adjust fields to serve as temporary overflow zones. And all of it, the computer models, the concrete barriers, the agricultural zoning relies on one ancient idea. A country can survive anything if it maintains its systems. A world watching quietly. Nations from around the world now consult Dutch engineers for water management. Jakarta, New Orleans, Bangladesh, Venice. But what these nations import is not just technology, it's a mindset. That risk must be managed, not ignored. That vigilance must be institutional, not heroic. That engineering without maintenance is just sculpture. And perhaps most importantly, that victory over nature is temporary, stewardship is eternal. So we end this story with a reflection not just on land, but on life. If a people can build their nation 1 inch at a time, shovel by shovel, pump by pump, then perhaps history is not shaped by those who conquer, but by those who quietly hold the line. Story 6. Roman water bills, aqueduct maintenance in the late empire. In the minds of most, Rome is a city of monuments, forums, temples, arenas. But long before it became an empire, Rome was a city of plumbing. By the time of Emperor Augustus, Rome had 11 aqueducts, bringing in hundreds of millions of gallons of fresh water every day. Not for irrigation, not for agriculture, but for urban life: baths, fountains, latrines, and private homes. This story is not about the grandeur of Roman aqueducts, but about their management. Because water once delivered must be accounted for, measured, divided, inspected. This is the story of how Rome's most invisible infrastructure became a mirror of its slow, quiet decline. The engineering of excess. Rome's first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was completed in 312 BCE, over 2 centuries before the first emperor. It ran mostly underground, following the Roman principle of minimizing exposure and maximizing durability. But as the city grew, so did its thirst. By the 1st century CE, under the direction of emperors like Augustus and Claudius, Rome had a sprawling network of aqueducts, some running over 50 miles, crossing valleys on massive arches, and delivering water with a gradient so gentle it descended just a few inches per mile. The engineering was elegant, but the administration was even more impressive. Water in Rome was a public utility, and an intensely political one. The curator aquarum, the Roman water manager. The system was overseen by a special official, the curator aquarum, or water commissioner. This was no lowly bureaucrat. Often a senator or former consul, the curator was responsible for inspecting aqueduct routes, allocating water among users, approving new taps or fistulae, lead pipe connections, enforcing fines for unauthorized use. He was supported by an entire team: architecti engineers, aquarii technicians and pipe fitters, castellarii reservoir keepers, fountainarii fountain managers, librarii scribes and record keepers. Water didn't just flow, it was tracked, taxed, and maintained. In this way, Rome's water system functioned like a modern utility company, only written on papyrus and maintained by men in togas. Measuring the flow. The Romans didn't charge by volume, they charged by pipe size. Each fistula was a standard lead pipe. Its diameter determined how much water a property received. The official stamp on the pipe included the owner's name, permit date, and legal flow rate. Inspections were routine. Officials checked for illegal widening of pipes, a common form of theft. Some wealthier Romans installed cisterns to store excess water. Others bribed aquarii to divert flows. Water was abundant, but it wasn't free. And in a city of over 1 million people, distribution required both law and spreadsheets, or rather, wax tablets. Fountains, baths, and prestii. Public fountains, or nymphia, were more than utilities, they were monuments of imperial generosity. Rome had over 1,300 public fountains by the 3rd century CE. Each was fed by gravity, regulated by sluice gates, and monitored by fountainarii. They became landmarks, meeting places, status symbols, political gestures. Bathhouses like the baths of Caracalla required staggering amounts of water. One estimate suggests that Caracalla's complex alone used nearly as much water per day as the modern city of Boston. To keep these systems running meant not just engineering, but diplomacy, balancing water allocations between elite estates, commercial laundries, bakeries, and the poor. The water flowed freely, but behind every spout was a ledger. Early signs of decay. By the 3rd century CE, as Rome faced political and economic crises, signs of infrastructure fatigue began to appear. Some aqueducts were damaged by invasion or neglect. Funds for maintenance were diverted to military needs. The growing bureaucracy struggled to keep accurate records. In the provinces, aqueducts that had once symbolized Roman civilization fell into disrepair. In Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, pipes clogged, arches cracked, water stopped. In Rome, the flow continued, but at increasing cost. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was changing. Gone were the days of expansion and optimism. Now came pressure from outside borders, economic inflation, rapid urban growth, and the grinding weight of an overextended bureaucracy. And yet, water still poured into the city, aqueducts still crossed the countryside, fountains still sparkled in public squares. But beneath the marble facades and echoing baths, something quieter was happening. Paperwork was piling up, budgets were being stretched, and the system was beginning to leak, not just physically, but administratively. This was not a collapse, it was a slow forgetting. Aqueducts at the edge of empire. Outside Rome, in the provinces, aqueducts had been symbols of Romanization. Towns like Nimes, Segovia, and Carthage boasted grand aqueducts with arches, cisterns, and fountains. But provincial cities often lacked the vast maintenance machinery of the capital. Their aqueducts depended on local funding, technicians trained in Roman engineering, access to replacement parts and lead pipe. As imperial stability declined, so did these systems. Roads became less safe, delaying repairs. Workshops closed or relocated. Taxes were redirected to military garrisons rather than maintenance. In Gaul, an aqueduct might break in 260 CE and remain broken for decades. Without central oversight, water infrastructure outside Rome often decayed invisibly. Inside the city, overload and obstruction. Back in Rome, the city's water system was still functioning but showing signs of chronic stress. Illegal taps were multiplying. Pipe records were incomplete or falsified. Maintenance crews were underpaid or undertrained. Public fountains were prioritized over private supply, causing friction with the elite. A new kind of theft became common, not stealing gold but stealing water. Some homeowners hired rogue plumbers to drill into lead pipes, creating hidden taps behind walls or under floors. Inspectors had to crawl through crawl spaces and cisterns to locate unregistered flows. To regulate this, the imperial government produced reams of legislation, trying to keep pace. Limits on the number of private pipes per property. Mandates to re-register old connections. Instructions to install official seal on approved fistulae. The curator aquarum's office ballooned in size, but not in effectiveness. The paper empire of water. Rome's water administration left behind mountains of documentation. Legal edicts. Pipe diameter registers. Repair receipts. Technician rosters. Property maps annotated with flow permits. This was one of Rome's great innovations, the bureaucratization of infrastructure. But over time, the very records meant to enforce order became sources of confusion. Old permits overlapped with new boundaries. Tax rolls listed owners who had long died. Some pipe stamps were forged. Like an empire too large to manage, the water system began to suffer from its own complexity. You could still hear water in the fountains, but no one knew for certain how it got there. The rise of private wells. As aqueduct maintenance faltered, wealthy citizens sought alternatives. Private wells dug within city limits. Rainwater cisterns added to villas. Small storage tanks installed under gardens. This shift mirrored broader social patterns. A turn inward. A loss of public trust. A retreat from civic systems. Even the famed public baths began to decline. Some closed altogether, others operated only partially. The baths of Caracalla, once a marvel, became a shell, fed by dwindling supplies. Some senators began foregoing aqueduct water entirely, using private means to keep their fountains trickling while public troughs ran dry. It was a quiet privatization not decreed, but drifted into. Invasions, earthquakes, and erosion. Rome's infrastructure had always been vulnerable to the world beyond its walls. Earthquakes in the 4th century damaged key aqueduct bridges. Germanic invasion disrupted rural sections of the water lines. Stone from old aqueducts was pillaged for new walls and churches. In 410 CE, when the Visigoths sacked Rome, they did not destroy the aqueducts. They didn't need to. Enough disruption to maintenance crews, to rural outposts, to administrative offices, and the water would simply stop. Which it did, gradually. By 537 CE, during the Gothic War, the Ostrogoths intentionally cut the aqueducts into Rome. The city went dry overnight. Emperor Justinian's general, Belisarius, was forced to rely on wells and river water during his defense. The water that had flowed for nearly 800 years was finally silenced by siege, by strategy, and by decades of decline. A system designed to be maintained. Roman aqueducts were not built to last forever. They were built to be inspected, patched, and preserved, like all infrastructure they required. Schedules, labor, funding, institutional memory. But empires like pipes leak, and when no one remembers where the joints are, the whole thing collapses in silence. And yet, some aqueduct sections of them still survive today, not because they resisted time, but because someone somewhere took care of them until they didn't. So we end this section with a question, both literal and philosophical. What do we inherit when the water stops, and all that remains is a map no one can read, and pipes no one dares to open? The water stopped, not all at once but in stages. A pipe cracked here, a valve rusted shut there. A section collapsed, a budget vanished, a record was lost. Rome's aqueducts, once engineering marvels, became silent corridors of air and stone. And yet they didn't disappear. They lingered in the landscape, arches towering over sheep pastures, fragments built into monasteries, channels hidden beneath gardens and modern roads. This final section explores what happened to Rome's aqueducts after they ceased to function, and how they came to symbolize both the persistence of design and the impermanence of systems. The medieval city, surviving without the flow. By the 6th century, Rome's population had shrunk dramatically from over 1 million to perhaps 30,000 people. Many districts were abandoned. The forums echoed. The baths stood cold and empty. Without the aqueducts, public fountains ran dry. Bathhouses shut their doors. Wells in the Tiber became primary water sources, less clean, less reliable. The city adapted, not efficiently, not gracefully, but incrementally. People collected rainwater in clay jars. Churches built cisterns. Wealthier Romans left the city entirely, retreating to countryside villas where springs still bubbled. Rome didn't die. It drifted into a quieter, thirstier version of itself. Aqueducts reborn as buildings. Even as water stopped flowing, the aqueducts themselves remained massive, durable, and temptingly rich in building materials. Stones from aqueduct arches were quarried to build Christian churches. Lead pipes were melted down for bullets or roofing. Brick channels became the foundations of new homes. In this way, the water system was not erased, it was recycled, layered into medieval Rome, hidden under vineyards, absorbed into convents, roads, gardens. Some monasteries even reused surviving water channels, creating rudimentary plumbing for abbeys. In small ways, the ghost of the Roman system still served without maps, without permits, without curators. The Renaissance, rediscovering the pipes. During the 15th and 16th centuries, as interest in classical Rome revived, so did efforts to restore its ancient water systems. Pope Nicholas V, in the mid-1400s, ordered the partial restoration of the Aqua Virgo, an ancient aqueduct, originally built in 19 BCE by Marcus Agrippa. It was renamed the Aquae Virgin, and it once again brought water into the city. Over time, more ancient channels were repaired, rerouted, or imitated. The Aquae Fellis, 1587, reactivated portions of the Aqua Alexandrina. The Aquae Paula, 1612, built on remains of the Aqua Triana. Each project was a hybrid: ancient foundation, Renaissance ambition, modern necessity. And at the end of each channel, a fountain celebrating not just the return of water, but the memory of water. The fountain as ruin and renewal. Rome's fountains became visual metaphors for continuity and loss. The most famous, the Trevi Fountain, is fed by the still operating Aquae Virgin. It stands at the terminal point of an aqueduct nearly 2,000 years old. Behind the statues and theatrics lies a Roman-era channel. Beneath the water's sparkle lies the labor of unremembered workers. And beneath the marble lies a truth: Systems endure only when someone continues to care for them. The Trevi is beautiful not just because of its design, but because it represents invisible effort made visible again. Lessons in stone and silence. Modern engineers still study Roman aqueducts. Their durability, gradients, and materials remain models of low-tech sustainability. But perhaps the most enduring lesson isn't technical. Rome's water system teaches us that even the best infrastructure requires maintenance. Systems fail not in moments, but over generations of forgetting. Bureaucracy, however dull, is the lifeline of civilization. And that ruins are not just remnants of collapse, but archives of intention. The quiet legacy. Today, Rome is no longer thirsty. It has modern pipes, pressurized systems, chlorinated tanks, but some of its water still runs through ancient roots. A few stone channels still carry flow. A few medieval cisterns still echo with drops. A few papal fountains still burst forth from aqueducts built by emperors. And underneath it all, the city remembers silently that its greatness once rested on something humble: the careful tracking of water bills, the timely repair of pipes, and the patient work of engineers whose names were never carved into marble. So we close this story with a final thought. What do we owe the systems that shaped us? Not the grand designs, but the quiet ones that broke down slowly and waited patiently to be remembered?